Good evening, everyone. Happy New Year. I'd like to welcome everybody to a historic evening. Again, the very first council meeting for the town of Salisbury. Before we begin, I'd like to welcome the new councillors and the returning councillors. Again, thank you for everybody for putting your names forward and serving our public. It's going to be, again, a monumentous several few years as we work together to join our new community and again, a great community already and making it even better as we go along. So with that, the meeting tonight, the participants need to be advised that the meeting is to be recorded for the public access broadcast, which is going to be recorded and put online for people to be watching. So with that, I'd like to call the meeting to order. We'll have and that will be moved by Councillor Dettori, seconded by Councillor Gallant. All in favor? Contrary minded, motion carried. The adoption of the agenda, which you would have received in your package.
So moved.
So moved by Councillor
Horn.
Thorne.
Thank you.
I'm gonna be along that already. Councillor Thorne, seconded by Councillor Lee Dykstra. All in favor? Contrary minded, motion carried. If there are any conflict of interest declarations, please proceed. There's forms on the desk. Please fill them out based on the agenda you would have received earlier. With that, do I have a motion for the adoption of the minutes? So moved by Councillor Oblinus, seconded by Councillor Gallant. Any questions to the motion? All in favor?
Aye.
Contrary minded, motion carried. You would have received in your package some consent agenda items for you to pursue and go through. So now we'll move on to the public and administration presentations.
Okay, let's see if we can pull that up, Diane, then we can get started. All right, so we are happy to last share our presentation on our 2023 budgets, meaning the operating and capital budgets, which is the first budget, obviously, for the town of Salisbury. What I would say will be long awaited. I'll preface this presentation with the caveat that this was an interesting year from a budgeting perspective in the sense that, as you all know, both council and municipal administration had little to no involvement in the budget process in light of municipal reform. So we are very much so on the staff side learning as we go. I'll also preface that the majority of municipalities that we've connected with throughout the last couple of weeks are just receiving their budgets as of late last week in the mail for the very first time. So this is the first time that they're seeing it. Obviously, this is very late compared to the usual budgeting process and throws a few wrenches into things. I'll say it many, many times as we talk about municipal reform, but I do consider us to be very lucky considering comparable municipalities and what some entities are going through when it comes to things like budgeting. So bear with us as we go through. Diane, if you want to go to the next slide. So in essence, what we'll run through today is the budget at a glance to try to give you some numbers to understand what this means for residents of the new entity. We'll go through a few of the concepts, changes, high-level items that are occurring related to the budget in light of the local governance reform process. We'll run through the two budgets, the operating being the majority and the focus, and the utility budget, which is specific to the former Village of Salisbury subunit. More to come on what a subunit is, but that's specific to the former village. And then we'll talk a little bit about what next steps look like and what council and as well as the public can expect as we move forward this year and into future years. Go to the next slide. So obviously, like I mentioned, the local governance reform has dominated our budget conversations this year. It's different from one entity to another, but we'll just run through some of the terms or concepts that you'll hear us refer to tonight, but as well as the remainder of the year. And then we'll see from year to year how many of these things stick around. Go to the next one. So subunits. So in essence, there are 5 in total in Salisbury. Each former municipal entity constitutes a subunit. So the former Village of Salisbury is its own subunit. The portion of the LSD of Coverdale that we received is a subunit. The portion of the LSD of Salisbury that we received is a subunit, so on and so forth. Each of the subunits historically has had their own tax rate, which means that when you create a brand new budget consisting of 5 different tax rates, it's nearly impossible to get them all to the same spot without looking at them individually in their own respective rates, which is what these subunits is intended to do. Moving forward, council will determine what subunits look like, if they exist even, and how that will be separated. So a few options that the province has basically inferred to, depending on a case-by-case basis, would be merging all the subunits to have one, having an inside, meaning the former village, and outside subunits, keeping them as is over a course of a few years to get them closer. That'll depend on different expenses that will be made aware of, different services that are required to be offered, so on and so forth. The goal in the future should be to reduce subunits. It makes it much easier from a budgeting perspective, especially to keep it clear, concise, and transparent for residents. So that should be the overall intent. And the overall budget is assigned based on costs that are assigned to the subunit. So each subunit gets their respective costs based on essentially the percentage of the entity that they assume, or based on pre-agreed upon contracts, expenses, agreements in place. Those stay specific to each respective subunit. We'll go to the next one. So the non-residential rates. So in essence, the property tax rates are determined by local governments, and there are two. There's the non-residential and the residential rate. We generally hear about the residential rate, which is the impact that people get in their mailbox in their property tax bill. The non-residential rate applies to properties that are non-residential. The difference being this year that the province provided flexibility to municipalities. So generally, this non-residential rate is 1.5 times that of the residential rate that's determined by the local government. This year, or starting in 2023, for the 2023 tax year, municipalities could go on a sliding scale between 1.4 and 1.7%. We stuck at 1.5 through the facilitator, so that'll be a future conversation for council to determine what that might look like. There were changes at the provincial level that offset costs. So a lot of places, depending again on where it is, if they increased it up towards the 1.6, 1.7, that didn't necessarily trickle down costs, for lack of a better term, because of changes that were made at the provincial level. But the important piece in the context of local governance reform is that many municipalities that are not affected as much as Salisbury are using this non-residential rate flexibility to be able to decrease their residential rates. And so that includes a lot of the neighboring municipalities. And so if this is why I mention this, if we were to implement the full 1.7%, the additional revenue or revenue that would be generated from that is shown up on the screen. So you can see some comparable municipalities based on geography as well as size or comparable service. And you can see that there is a significantly higher number. So a lot of entities are able to use that because by increasing that, not causing more on the tax bill, it gives more flexibility with the residential rate that they also determine. Just keep that in mind as we go through this change this year, because this will be a decision of council as we go into the next budgeting year, because while it won't give us a huge amount of flexibility, there is some flexibility there to consider in the context of residential rates. We go to the next one, which is on equalization. So this is probably one of the most challenging concepts, I would say, to explain in a reform and a non-municipal reform year. In essence, the provincial government has what they call an equalization and core funding components of a grant that's provided to municipalities. It's provided, in essence, the justification is based on the level of service that has to be met by a municipality and the funds that are required, and trying to find a balance there somehow. So for instance, if you were to look at neighboring municipalities as close as Petitcodiac, they get a significantly amount more than Salisbury, and it's always challenging to explain the rationale as to why. That's been a question for previous councils here, but it's also been a question because the number fluctuates a lot from year to year. And so this is a historical grant that has been in place for a number of years, but will be phased out over the next 5, the first being 2023. So in essence, they plan, as of now, to reduce the amount 20% each year for the next 5 years. And in 2023, the 20% that was removed from the municipal entities is going towards the service commissions to offset the costs of RSC, or Regional Service Commission mandated fees. So just historically, so you can see some of the numbers. In 2022, the number was just over or closer to 95,000. In 2021, It was just shy of 197,000, and in 2020 it was just shy of 205,000. So it fluctuates from year over year. There's not any huge assets, for instance, that have been added in those. But they do compare it to level of service and tax base or tax rate required to deliver that level of service. But it will be again phased out over the next 5 years or 4 years if you don't include this year. Moving on to next. So the concept of shared and local service. So again, this is new to the budget concepts for this year and forms the essence of our budget in addition to subunits. So basically a local service, true to its name, is a service that's provided to a specific local area or a specific subunit. So in the instance of wastewater or sewer for the commonly referred to term, in the village, the outside subunits that are not serviced with municipal sewer will not pay for municipal sewer. It pretty much comes down to that. Any debt or surplus, which for us mostly applies to the existing village, will not be transferred on to the outside subunits. Any future capital assets will be, however. Grants or previous agreements and existing contracts. So for instance, every individual subunit has its own respective agreement currently in place for waste collection. So they're responsible in each of their own subunits to cover that local service. Shared services are, in essence, all of the other services that form the municipal budget. So for instance, general government, which is the service area of the municipal budget that covers municipal buildings, staff salaries, council remuneration, recreation and culture. So just broadly, recreation is considered a shared service. And like I was mentioning, any new cost or debt that's absorbed by the new entity will be considered a shared service moving forward. The easiest way that I can try to summarize it, that's been summarized or mentioned to us by the province, has been if a subunit has access to a service, they are considered shared in some way. So that covers something like recreation. For instance, there's a pool in Salisbury, the village, or the former village, within that subunit, but that can be accessed and arguably is by outside areas. So their rationale is that it can be accessed and therefore it can be considered shared. Take it with what you will. That's the rationale that they pass on to us. And this is important to consider because this is a change compared to what we were told throughout the process that would apply to us. So the facilitators had the opportunity to apply, in essence, a certain percentage of shared service. So they could say that all of the outside areas pay 100% of the shared service cost. They could do it to a reduced percentage. So ours is a reduced percentage, and they, in essence, consider that for two primary reasons. One being the nature of distance. So someone in the former village subunit is not as close to the Lions Pool as someone in an outside subunit. That's the first one, just the fact that they can be farther. The second is that the fact that recognizing that a lot of the existing personnel in place will by default spend time on things that are specific to the subunit. So whether that is our admin staff processing sewer bills or our admin staff spending time on complaints for sidewalks that are specific to the village subunit. Recognizing that there is a cost there that's not being directly provided to the outside subunits, that's the second piece. And so our percentage for the outside subunits is 90%. So in essence, in simple layman terms, the subunits get their respective shared versus local costs. At the end, at the bottom line, it provides an overview of what the cost in cents essentially is for shared service. And then the outside subunits only pay 90% of that cost. So the cost is about 33 cents for shared service, and the outside subunits are paying about 30 cents. So when you see the bottom line on the tax rate that someone's getting in the mail, if that were to be at 100%, it would be, again, simple layman terms, 3 cents higher than what we're seeing this year. If we go to the next slide. The special provincial levy. So this is something that only applies to the outside former LSD subunits. The easiest way that I can explain this one is this is the comparable budget to what we see in the former village as the transportation line item. It covers roads, snow plowing, in the former village, sidewalks, those sorts of things. And so this applies to every former LSD subunit in the province. unless the municipal entity decides to take this on, which we're hearing that some are exploring that at least. But in essence, 0.4115 of the assessment per $100 of assessment goes directly to the province under this special provincial levy. It's provided to DTI to provide those services. So on top of comparing it to our transportation budget, covers things like roads, paving, maintenance, and plowing. And then this year we'll be not negotiating, but discussing maintenance agreements with DTI, where we'll have a little bit better of an idea of what that service level will look like with DTI that's provided by them. Next one. So the Regional Service Commission mandated services. So as part of the regional or the local governance reform process, the province has given, like they have to us, more responsibilities to the Regional Service Commission. And so this is generally something that we get as part of the budgeting process for services that we currently have, and now they'll be offering additional ones. The service commission that we're a part of in the Southeast is the largest in the province, which this year especially is to our benefit because there are more partners that are involved in the cost sharing process. There are some regional service commissions that have only a few municipalities that pay into them, and so we're fortunate there. In the addition of the fact that they're taking a prudent approach to their budgeting, which means that as opposed to unrealistically setting a budget for services that won't humanly be possible to be offered next year, they're taking time to essentially plan strategies and plans to then figure out where do they go with these new services, because it is acknowledged, in fact, it is new for them too. So the cost breakdown for the new entity, with the caveat that this dollar number is not within the budget because it's covered by the RSC grant. That's the 20% of our former equalization grant. So to make things all confusing, that's where these services are coming from. So in essence, in the budget, it's a net zero expense. But to give you an idea of what it would cost, because the RSC grant was announced after the Regional Service Commission had started their budgeting. So these were the costs that were provided to us, but they also provide an overview of what the new services are. So regional transportation, social and community development, regional recreation, infrastructure cost sharing, regional economic development, and regional tourism, for a total cost of just shy of $42,000 for the new mandated services. So this will be certainly a conversation that we'll be having on a number of fronts, and all municipalities across the province and all regional service commissions will, as the year goes on this year as well as future years, to determine what these services look like. How can we make sure that we can get an ROI, a return on our expenses? But this is the information that we have for now, at least, on the mandated services. There is, yes, yeah, sure.
Just to be clear on this.
Yeah.
This 41,944 is what the town would have paid,
Correct.
and not just
It's about
everybody.
0.7, 5.6, 0.7 cents that we would have paid, so the town is absorbing that with the equalization payment that's being removed. So the LSTs didn't absorb any of that cost. It is strictly being absorbed by the residents.
The former equalization grant.
Former residents.
So there was a lot of mention and confusion, I would say, around a cap on residential increases, being around the 5 cent limit. So an increase or decrease capped at that. That's what we were told. That's what many municipalities were told. There were exceptions to this cap. And so some of them being to brand new entities, the cap didn't apply, for instance. Certain expenses not applying, and also to provide some flexibility to avoid prolonging essentially the offset or subsidizing outside areas for the most part, to meet that 5 cent cap. And so in essence, what you'll see on the next slide, I believe, on the next slide is a picture of the spreadsheet that I'll use to explain it a little bit more. But there's the concept of internal transition funding. And so what this mechanism is in areas or municipal entities that had subunits that warranted a decrease in taxes, in property taxes, they would use internal transition to avoid decreasing, to subsidize other subunits to meet that 5 cent cap and be able to meet it. In Salisbury, the reality is that our former subunit, the former village subunit tax rate is low. And so it provided very little flexibility to actually offset increases elsewhere. And so we just got more information on this last Thursday, I think it was, when it was unexpected, but we got a call from the province on this because we were asking some questions and not quite getting clarity. And so that's the easiest way that it was explained to us. So if you go to the next slide, Diane, you can see that this is a piece of the spreadsheet that the province provides to municipalities. And you can see at the top where it says duration of transition in years. And so this would be if you're offsetting, in essence, tax rates over more than 1 year. So for lack of better term, if you're not biting the bullet in the first year, and an entity or a subunit within the entity was offsetting some of the costs. So you can see that if we were to do it over 2 years, the internal transition funding would be about $209,000. And you can see a lot of red, obviously. But if you look at the Elgin Parish line in particular, because that's the only subunit within the entity that saw a decrease, you can see that their tax rate skyrocketed in the sense that it would be $6.28 per $100 of assessment. So that's because it's the only subunit that saw a decrease. So in essence, it wasn't really applicable to us, is the easiest way. And so there's a couple other tools, I would say, within their template that helps, I guess, us rationalize it a little bit, but that's the easiest way to show is that the internal transition funding is really if there are subunits. For instance, if the former village subunit was higher and warranted a decrease based on these shared services, then we could use a 2-year or a 3-year, 4-year, depending on the amount, to offset some of the increases. So if we just go back to the last slide just quickly. And so one of the rationales is around council and staff, in particular the CAO remuneration costs. So just for the sake of obviously transparency as we work to determine this across the board, so municipal wide, including the addition of the CAO salary on a full year basis, as well as other staff changes that have taken place between the difference of the 2022 and 2023 budget year. It's 79,000. Council remuneration is just a little bit over that, with net gain of councillors as well. So it doesn't obviously offset more than that 5 cents, but you will hear it in a lot of entities that's part of the reason. I would argue it's only part of the reason and not the full equation. If we go 2 slides, I guess, if we skip the next one. So if we're diving in now to the 2023 budget at a glance, before we do that, I guess I can ask if there's any other questions, just so I don't keep talking if there are questions before you forget.
I have a quick question. The RSC grant, is that just a 2023 thing, or will we see that for the next
Good
5
question.
years as well?
With 4 more years. after
We don't
that.
know. We don't know for sure. We don't know for sure. So every year, what we do know is they will take 20% more of our equalization grant. We don't know what will happen with the RSC grant.
Okay.
Yeah. Chances are they probably will keep doing that, but I would argue that a lot of people are asking the same question. Nobody really knows yet.
I just want to make a comment, having been on the committee, is that that's one thing we're gonna have to be very, very cognizant of. I know that Austin and his team is the potential for increased costs coming from the services that the Regional Service Commission will take on. And so if we're going to have increased costs as a result of that, we need to make sure that our residents are getting some sort of benefit from this
Right.
increased cost.
Oh, absolutely.
We're not just subsidizing.
I mean, to Austin's point, in different areas of the province, our RSC was very prudent in that they're taking the time
Yep.
to do a strategy plan to come up with clear KPIs to do so. So they've been very prudent around that. Other areas of the province, I mean, when Austin's mentioning that those hits, other areas of the province are seeing just from the RSC 6 cents on top of the tax increases as well. And I'd go back to that 0.7 that again was absorbed because of the equalization. This year, although, you know, not great, we came out of it very well, at least to allow exactly to your point. I will give the RSC as well as the board of directors credit around ensuring that we are able to come back to you all and tell what's going to be received for that increase.
I will mention one thing that I forgot to. The transition, so if we had an internal transition piece that was required, that would hold council limited again, creating the 2024 budget. So you would have to, in essence, stay to that unless you found the funds somewhere else. And so by, again, for lack of a better term, absorbing the increase this year, it allows council the flexibility and I would say the normalcy, what we're used to be able to do what you wish with your priorities for next year. And so a lot of municipal entities will not be in that situation if they're using the internal transition funding mechanism that is available to the facilitators for this year. Any other budget questions so far before?
May not know the answer to this.
That's okay. That's true.
The provincial levy that's being applied to the outside areas.
Yeah.
How close is that number to what we pay inside for our roads?
I do know that. It's a few slides in. Yeah, we will cover that. If I don't mention it specifically, just ask it again because it is on one of the
Because I'm
slides.
just
I'll try to point it
Kind
out.
of reading the tea leaves that someday we may have to absorb that. And I'm
Yeah.
wondering if
Yeah.
it's enough.
Yes, yeah, it is. It's, I would say, comparable, but not the exact same and not the same amount of service offered as well. So, but yes, it is on the dollar value is close. Okay, so if we dive in, so just to kind of go over in a little bit more detail, the process, just to put it all out there, I guess, like I said, this is a budget that was given to us by the province. In the spring and summer of earlier this year, there was a survey that was circulated to identify priorities. I would say are the general priorities that we hear on a day-to-day, even outside of a budget exercise per se. It's nothing surprising. Things like roads, things like parks, things like trails, those sorts of things that are included on a day-to-day basis in municipal services. A draft budget was submitted to the facilitator on October 25th. And so internally, staff did work to make sure that their priorities were outlined, that we had a good understanding of what expenses were, things like fixed expenses. That is a concern if some person at the province is creating a budget and may not have a good understanding of what these fixed or required expenses are. And that was the last that we saw of the budget. We did have some clarification on certain expenses or budget lines in November, but there was no further review of the budget, of costs, or of any budget lines after that. We received the signed budget on December 16th. Received it in the mail not long after, before the holidays, I think, or it was in between, before the holidays. And again, are still awaiting answers on certain outstanding questions, specifically from our facilitator. So we have some clarity on process through the province when we spoke to them last week, but we have a number of questions for our facilitator, including where some things are, what some things shifted to. So obviously not ideal, but again, and I hate to use this example, but we are in much better shape than some who, including large municipalities with a lot of services and a lot of staff that only received their budgets last Thursday in the mail. So that's a bit of a shock, I would say, which means they only found out their tax rates last week, for instance, past the start of January. So it's not an ideal process, but I do want to make sure that it is super clear. Super clear how we got here. Looking at the 2023 property tax rates. So this is what was published a couple of weeks ago by the office here, by I guess the former village office, now town office. But these are what people will see on their rates next year. This includes, for the outside areas, the 0.4115 special provincial levy, which doesn't apply to the former village subunit. But you can see across the board, everywhere saw increases with the exception of the LSD subunit of Elgin Parish that saw about a 2-cent decrease. The former village subunit saw just shy of 1 cent increase. And then Moncton, Coverdale, and Salisbury LSDs respectively saw a higher increase, with Salisbury being just shy of 10 cents, Coverdale being just shy of 8, and Moncton LSD being, keep things simple, 8 cents on the dot. And you can see the percentage different below. So you'll hear two different percentage differences, one of which is the percentage difference of that rate. So the total rate, the difference of, in essence, what people will pay based on their assessment next year. And you'll see the percentage difference in services provided by the local government. It was a little bit confusing, and in the initial rates that was provided to council, I will say we did increase, and by we I mean me in this case. It made it a little bit confusing by including the percentage of rates offered by local governments. So this is the percentage difference that you'll see overall in the total tax rate, everything included. If we go to the next slide, this shows a little bit of what someone will pay on their property tax bill. So in each of the subunits, when someone gets their tax bill in the next couple of months, and just for the sake of a number, we use a residential assessment of 200,000. So on the bottom line, you can see what someone will pay in each subunit with a residential assessment of 200,000. We could do 1,000 of these examples with the number, but it's just to somewhat quantify where these dollars go to. So you can see some of the main differences, obviously, in the top line, the special provincial levy. Obviously, that's no residents of the former Village of Salisbury subunit will be paying that. And comparably or likewise, on the fourth line down under transportation, no former LSD subunit will be paying that because it's something that's offered exclusively by the province. So those are, in essence, comparable. There's a few lines in there that throughout the budget that former subunits are not paying for because they're considered local expenses of the former village. The only one that shows up in the total overall service area is public health services. And that's just a small line item that the former village has to essentially offer nurse practitioner space. So that's why it says a small dollar value and then zero. But just for the sake of quantifying, you can see it differs depending on subunit, but can quantify. So for instance, if we look at protective services across the board, that's generally the highest in most municipal entities, and that's costs such as the RCMP contract, bylaw enforcement, fire, other enforcement, which is essentially bylaw, and things like animal control, for example. So to quantify that, if you're in the Coverdale LSD, you're paying just shy of 500 if you have a $200,000 assessment, versus in the Salisbury LSD, you're paying, again, just shy of 500, but about 496. So just to essentially show what someone will be paying for those types of services, just to keep in mind as we talk through what some of those budget lines include as we go through the operating budget. On the next slide, I will preface this again that it is an average. So if we look again using the $200,000 assessment rate, this is an example of what someone will pay 2022 versus 2023 in light of the fact that assessments have also increased. So it's not lost on us the fact that across the province-wide, residential assessment values are increasing, and when those increase on top of residential rates increasing, it means a higher bill as well. So if we look, for example,
Double tax?
sorry,
A double tax?
in a way, it at least a double impact, let's say. So and I'll preface it with the assessments are done entirely separate from the municipality. They're done through Service New Brunswick, but they fund the municipal operating budgets. So if we look at a $200,000 assessment in the former village, in 2022, they would have paid $1,0442, and their bill would have been $2,088. A 12.4% increase, which across the province, the average is about 10%. In the Salisbury subunit, the average increase is 12.84%. And so that's the number that's used, again, just to quantify for the sake of an example. So if we increase it up to $225,680, you can see, I don't know if we can move that little piece, Diane, sorry. I should have used a different example other than the Salisbury subunit. They'll now pay $2,373.48 for a difference of $285. So while the cent on the tax rate did not increase that much in the former village, the bill will be different if someone was affected by a substantial increase. And again, this isn't apples to apples because the reality is that on a tax bill, the actual dollar value that someone will pay will be capped at 10%. But again, the assessment still stays. So over time, they will get to that payment. But just to show the difference, again, acknowledging the fact that assessments have increased, as are the rates in the Salisbury or in the new Salisbury entity. And you can see that across the board. So the assessments obviously at 12.84% are the same in all of them. And you can see on the final column what that looks like for a $200,000 a home assessed at $200,000. To go to the next slide.
So I have a question on that.
Sure.
Going based on the fact that the former LSDs were paying approximately 90% of what the village is currently paying.
For shared
Just
services, shared services only, yeah.
Does that 10 cents cover all of the non-shared services?
10 cents,
difference.
like 10, you'll see that.
95 to 105.
You'll see that in a few slides. I'll show you exactly what the shared versus local are. If you go to the next one, this is one that I would encourage elected officials to keep in mind as we have all of these conversations with around the buying power of municipalities. So our operating budgets come from the property assessments and the property taxes that are levied on residences. And it is I would say, I guess we could say a dime in the bucket, shy of that, compared to what $1 of taxes go towards. So on average, municipalities receive about 8 cents of every dollar that goes into taxes. And so it is challenging at times to offer services because oftentimes they're stretched thin. All this to say is that there is a big reliance on municipalities on top of this operating budget to secure funding from these other two levels of government. And also keep in mind that 60% of Canada's public infrastructure is owned by those who only get 8 cents per dollar. So keep that in mind if talking about these high level budget concepts.
Can I just make one comment too?
Sure.
And that's a great point that you bring up, is that, and a lot of residents have asked me about this, and I'm sure that there are others that will be similarly interested, is when there's an issue, like a road, right, that needs to be fixed. Our residents need to understand, this is where we need their help in terms of escalating and, and going to the province and looking for funds to help for us to fix, let's say, a road in the town of Salisbury, understanding that all the other towns are doing exactly the same thing.
Mhm.
And all of the other towns are similarly in need of those roads to be fixed. So part of the job that council has, and the mayor's done a great job on some of the recent ones, is we need to work together to understand that we need to put our case before the provincial government so that we will get the funding that we need to fix roads that are, that we need the money for. It's not just something that we can just go ahead and do based on the revenue that we have.
Right, which comparatively is very limited when you compare apples to apples. This quantifies what, in essence, an increase of 1 cent looks like across the board. So the bottom line is the most important, a 1 cent increase in the residential property tax assessment brings in just shy of 71,000 for the operating revenue for the new entity. So moving forward, as we, in essence, let's say hypothetically, want to decrease or increase the cent by exactly 1 penny, that's what the difference would be. You would either get $70,851, or you would be out $70,851. So just keep that in mind again as we look at the budget moving forward.
Well, think about even the question earlier about the equalization payment. If we receive the same reduction next year, you're gonna be half of this, a little over half of the cent
Cover it.
that you're gonna cover that before you
And
ever start.
that equalization, I suspect, is only good for 2 years relative to what the new government at the time will do.
They keep it in place. Do you mean if they take it away and then put it back?
Whatever the new government.
I think we could be rest assured it's not coming back.
Yeah.
It's slowly been declining.
Yeah.
I think it's, and over the next several years, it will be gone. So
It will be 5 years, yeah.
Yeah, over 5 years, it will be totally gone. And we're, again, that's just before you ever start, that's something that needs to be, a shortfall that needs to be made up. But then keeping in mind assessment rates with Service New Brunswick, between, again, they've been crazy the last several years, but if they do steady out, and Diane can articulate this, if in the past, it would have been in a couple of percent range. We'd see each year on increases, not the 12 and 14% we're seeing. So typically that little bit of an increase would be enough to absorb those type of things.
But even 1% would be your penny, wouldn't it?
It would be, yeah, exactly. So typically that does occur, but then again, with cost of living and everything else that occurs pretty well, you're fighting that with RCMP increases and across the board. So
Inflation.
good enough, it's a good slide.
If you look at, this kind of, again, reiterates the piece around the municipal buying power, but fixed and variable expenses are important to keep in mind as well. So a municipal budget is, again, simple layman terms, not rocket science. There's a lot of fixed expenses. And so this is a rough sketch based on the fact that there's some things we just don't know yet around what's in the budget. But for at least a quick attempt based on what we do know. We have about 64% of our expenses that are fixed. So those are things that are contractual, are based on the tax base that we have within the municipality. Things like fiscal services, so debt, so on and so forth. We have about 27% that is semi-fixed, so certain elements that may be fixed that can be fluctuated a little bit. Personnel required services, so if council says we don't want to offer that service, okay, well, we have that pot of money that can go somewhere else. So semi-fixed. And then 9% that's variable. So things like events, programming, supplies that would not be semi-fixed, so on and so forth. So just to give a quick overview that there is often limited ways that we can move things around without chasing dollars, to Councillor Tory's point, from other levels of government. Next slide. So before we dive into some of what the budget lines are, the net budget is the concept, in essence, that has the total combined expenses minus our own source revenues. So there is limited own source revenues. We also dive into some of that. The unconditional grant in the budget line is the equalization funding that we've discussed from the province. And then the warrant is essentially the amount of funds that needs to be levied by property tax annually by the municipality. And so this year, before we dive into this, in essence, it was done by determining local versus shared service, determining the amount per subunit, and then determining what the warrant was to levy the tax accordingly. So before this will dive us into each of the kind of service areas of the budget. Before we go into that, any questions on the budget concepts, municipal reform concepts, before we dive into some more numbers? If we go to the next slide. So this just shows high level, basically the overview of budget service areas. So things like general government, protective services, public health services, environmental development, environmental health. And you can see that the gray and the red constitute a significant amount, just over 50% of the budget. That's transportation and protective services. So protective services across the board is generally the highest, like I was mentioning. And transportation is comparatively also high. This does not include the special provincial levy. So this only includes the funds that's being administered by the municipality of Salisbury. So if you were to throw in the 0.4115, it would be, like I was mentioning to Councillor Oblinas, comparable to that gray pie in the chart. It can make all the other ones a little bit smaller, but just to compare apples to apples. We can go to the next slide. It gives us an overview of non-tax revenue. So there is not a huge amount in our operating budget that is based on non-tax revenue. In the former Village of Salisbury subunit, there's three main ones. The biggest being the third bullet there, the transfer from the utility account. So annually a transfer is made from what is levied on municipal sewer bills into the operating account to account for the time and funds that are spent by personnel in administering the utility budget. So things like the transportation crew that's working on the ground on the pipes, as well as the admin team that is working on the billing, the collections, so on and so forth. Two other small ones, comparatively, animal control and lane marking. So animal control being the amount that's levied by dog tag licenses, and lane marking, which is in essence the responsibility for the most part of the province. But because we have an agreement with them where we do the line painting to ensure that it's done in a timely manner, and they charge us back, or we charge them and get revenue back later on in the year. Shared across the subunits, our recreation programming, so any revenue that's based on summer camps, fitness classes, pickleball, the Lions pool, is now considered a shared revenue stream across all of the subunits, just like the cost, as well as the sale of service to local governments. So in our case, normally in the former Village of Salisbury, there was a significant amount in the fire line in this area, generally to the tune of about 200,000, usually a little bit more, because that was coming in from the LSDs. And so now the former LSDs, for the most part, are part of the entity. So there's a very small number. It's about 4,000, I think, that's offered by our department to other entities. And the last one being construction. So that would be the cost for things like permits. And so that's considered a shared revenue stream. And if you go on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about that. That would be the most a little bit unpredictable, I would say, at this point in time, but in the budget, we have 35,000 budgeted for anticipated revenue, and that comes from the transition facilitators number. It's a question for us because it's unclear as to which portion of the LSD subunits are what I would personally call high permit activity. So we could have a portion of the Salisbury subunit, for instance, that hasn't had a permit hypothetically in 10 years. Well, we're not going to get the revenue that we're anticipating because it is based on percentages. So throughout the year, we'll be tracking that, as will the Service Commission, who administers our permits, and we'll be able to track it on a subunit by subunit basis, just so that we know moving forward. But it's generally something that is budgeted conservatively because you never know how many decks we built, how many homes we built. They're things that are variable, especially as we've seen in the last few years. So, for example, in 2022, in the former village subunit, we budgeted 4,000, and the actual revenue is about 15,000. So it is a big jump, and that's because, as we know, things are being built a lot more than they have been in recent years. So, just to give you some estimates for 2021, those are the latest numbers that we had when we were doing this for the subunits. We would, if we take exactly the percentages, be able to assume that in 2021, it was about 52,000. And again, that's percentage based. So we have no idea if the portion of the Elgin Parish LSD will bring in $424. Chances are it won't bring in any because it's such a small piece. If we look at the Moncton LSD, for instance, there's a big portion of that that's going to a new municipal entity. The place where that had most of that $90,000 in construction revenue could have been in that part of the new entity. So we really don't know. It'll be something that we'll have to determine as the year goes on. But just as the context as to where that $35,000 came from, because it's the biggest non-tax revenue line item that is there.
Are the permit rates the same across the area?
No. They're not. So the Plan 360 is coming in March to Committee of the Whole to give an overview of things like that. We were starting to look at the building bylaw, and they've told us that they're actually developing a template for municipalities because there have been changes to not the Planning Act, but there's a Building Code Act basically that needs to be reflected in the bylaws. So we'll have a template from them, but right now the outside areas actually pay more than the current inside village. It's $5 for the outside areas, and it's $3.50 for the inside areas. Don't quote me on that, but there is a difference there. So it will probably come to council early spring, I would say. They'll be here in March to explain council and walk them through that process, and then we'll come back with a recommendation on a bylaw to standardize it, because ultimately it's one of those things that can be easily standardized and has revenue attached to it. So. If we go to the budget overview, so this includes those key terms that we mentioned just before going into this section. It shows the tax base on the bottom as well as the warrant. So the overall tax base of the entity is about 708 million. The warrant is about 4.6, just to round down, 4.6 million, and the unconditional grant, which is that equalization, is 114,000 for next year, and the net budget working the way up is 4.78 million. So you can see across what that looks like, and so in essence what that means is that each of the subunits, those are the costs that are attributed to them. That would be local and shared services, to your question, that we'll dive into a little bit afterwards. If you go to the next slide. So this is the table that I was mentioning. So the cost for local versus shared, and the rate and the change. So the top row shows the rate for local service. So if you look across the board, it's comparable after the fact. You can see the village subunit is higher, and that's because of transportation, for example. So 71 cents, using the village as an example, of the $5 tax rate is based on local services. If you look across, it's closer to 23 cents on that tax rate in the outside subunits. And this is where, in the shared services, where you see the difference in that 90% to 100%. So in that bottom line, when we look at the last slide that shows what needs to be levied by the residential tax rate, you can see that the rate for shared service within the former village subunit is 0.3369 on that overall tax rate. Across the board in the outside subunits, it's 0.3032. And so you can see that's, in essence, that's that 90% versus 100% difference. The total rate for services for the local government, so that's by Salisbury, is that rate that you see across the board. So in essence, for the former village, it's the tax rate because there's no special provincial levy. And for the others, it's the local rate minus the tax rate, sorry, for minus the special provincial levy, which gives you that local rate. And then this is the other percentage that I inferred to earlier. That's the change from year over year in the services provided by the local government. So not the percentage difference of the overall tax rate, but the percentage difference of the rate that's provided by the municipal entity. So in this case, Salisbury. We go to the next one. This is where we'll start diving into, I'm almost done, I promise, the specific service areas. So general government, protective services, so on and so forth. And before I dive into them, I won't speak to each of what you see, each column on each slide, but you'll see on the bottom what the shared expense is for each service area, and then you'll see what the cost attributed to each specific subunit is. So if you look under general government, the majority of general government is considered a shared service. The total budget for this service area across the board is about 939,000. This covers a lot of what would be the routine day-to-day operations of a municipality. What we could say, keep the lights on. So it's council remuneration, things like office buildings, supplies, taxes, insurance, so on and so forth. And then each of the slides have some high-level items or new things. So this year we've added new counselors, and there's a change to counselor remuneration. We're hoping to do some renovations to reflect the fact that there is a huge, by huge I mean huge, lack of space municipal-wide. So for elected officials, we're crammed around the table, those sorts of things. There's limited space. And also to reflect the fact that there's some things like modernization that we're including in renovations, so equipment to equip this room to live stream meetings as opposed to record them, so on and so forth. We've increased our budget for legal services, not a huge amount, but it is an increase. And then we've added different software and tools for what we're calling basically organizational effectiveness. So you'll see in the coming months, we'll roll out a software called eScribe for council meetings. That's an expense under general government. Things, again, to keep the lights on, to keep the bills paid and the check signed, things like our accounting software, things that run our personnel side of things, HR software is included within this type of expense. Go to the next slide. Oh, sorry.
Quick question, just for clarity, on the 875,176. If we were to look at that, how is that divided? Is it divided into all the entities
Yes.
or just the,
All of them.
all
All
of
of
them?
them, yeah, across the board, based on basically that percentage. So,
So the
90%.
90%.
yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Protective services, so a significant number, 1.9 million. A lot of this has to do with the RCMP costs, which account for about 25% of our overall operating budget. It's a huge number. You'll hear it a lot at what I would say the political level of councils across the province, because many would argue the level of service isn't being met for the cost it's being paid, especially in outside areas. That's what we hear often. Anecdotally. Another big change that we're seeing on the budget line is contractual agreements with other local governments. So like I was mentioning, this used to be, in essence, the line in revenue for the fire department. But now that we have these former LSD subunits, we're actually paying a significant number to Moncton, to Riverview, and to Three Rivers, so formerly Petitcodiac, to the tune of $229,000. So our former operating budget for our fire department is now required to be paid out. So in essence, our fire department budget doubled. And so when I sent that to the fire chief, for instance, I don't get excited because this does not mean that your budget doubles. It means that our expenses essentially went up to the tune of doubling that budget line. There is some funds on top of that, looking ahead at professional services to plan for the new fire station. So the intent will be in the coming months to come to council with a recommendation to retain an engineering firm, more than likely an engineering firm. It could be an architectural, planning, so on and so forth, depending on their areas of expertise, to look at things like finalized site plans, prepare the tender for construction, updated costing so that we know what dollars we have to chase, as well as some increase for the 50th anniversary for the fire department. Their 50th anniversary will be in May of this year. From an incorporation date, had a meeting with the chief today, and he mentioned that their celebrations will probably be a little bit later in the year, but there's some budget for that. And then, like I mentioned, the RCMP cost. So if you look on the bottom, the numbers across the board make up that total 1.9 million. The reason that there are numbers across the board in each subunits is because the RCMP is attributed to specific subunits. We're not sure if that's how the bills will be paid. We don't really know. We anticipate it as what would be a shared cost, but at least it does kind of quantify that impact on the tax rate.
So those costs be negotiated in the future through RCMP?
With the RCMP, no, because they actually go, so the costs actually come from Justice and Public Safety provincially,
Yeah.
who administers the RCMP contract. So those are just given to us. It's a formula across the board based on tax rate. But what would be not necessarily negotiated, but discussed at the provincial level is around, is this the type of model of policing that New Brunswickers want, high level? The province is hearing a lot from municipalities, and the feds federally have also talked about, is RCMP warranted for boots on the ground policing, or are they intended for more specialized policing at more of a high level investigation, major crime, so on and so forth. So those discussions will, I presume, happen and be negotiated in the years to come, but the RCMP cost is basically, in the normal budgeting, you could speak to it, Diane, is basically, here's the cost, and that's pretty much it.
Yeah, normally over the years, we've known it's been about a 4% increase.
Yeah.
However, with a negotiation of a ratification of an agreement that was retroactive back to 2016. There's still some gray area in the year on, potential increases that we could all potentially have to absorb coming up that are not minor in any respect at all. So to Austin's point, it's being reviewed at the provincial level, and that'll be, one of the reviews that they're doing.
But even if the RCMP became specialized, would they not still require the same budget? Even if we were to.
If the
create a
RCMP
provincial
becomes specialized, it
police
may become a different type of a police force.
Yeah.
That does municipalities, so it could be municipal police forces. That you'll see in different areas of the province as well. It may not be cheaper, it may be more, and people just don't know that's part of the study.
It's relative to personnel too.
Because there's standards that need to be met, and it is relative to personnel, no question. So the idea of just going out and starting your own police force and
Well, speed cameras would be nice in terms of tying up resources there, but
Yeah.
it's all relative to what the goals are.
Even that's actually a good point you mentioned about negotiating. There's changes like from a legislation perspective to allow municipalities to recoup costs like that from speed
Right.
cameras to offset costs that they're paying. So there's some
if they could put those on the
flexibility, but
temporary road closure, the speed lights they have in our village, we can be rich. I'm just joking.
Or pay for the police bill, whatever the
Yeah.
case. is.
Yeah.
I think
It's really high.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you'd probably get the same argument most people living outside of the village too. The way people drive up and down Coverdale Road is pretty interesting. I think the challenge that we're gonna have, because it is what it is, and there's not much we can do, we have to have police and we have to have fire,
Yeah.
is that what we hear from a lot of residents is never see them.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I think,
Some
we're
level.
we're
Yeah,
obviously a
understand.
bigger entity, and when you look at the costs across the board, and I've had these questions at the RC, if you particularly look at Coverdale, or if you look at, Coverdale and Moncton. So are those routes being taken, for instance, the Coverdale, are they taking that route to come down through, or are they just driving through there to get to the highway area that they're servicing? So I would actually argue, in some cases, I've had this argument, that it's double dipping in that, and really, they're not really providing that service in some cases. It's just a drive-through to get to a destination.
Oh, yeah.
But,
Well, we hear them driving through, that's for sure.
those would be conversations we do have.
Yeah.
going forward.
I will mention on the oh, sorry, you're gonna.
I was just gonna say, on the fire departments, are the areas that we're paying to Moncton and Riverview and Three Rivers, are they very, very close to the areas we already cover?
To a certain extent. So I've had conversations with the chief to say, do these make sense? Are these numbers? Because it was a shell shock for us to say, "Oof, that's an expense that was not anticipated." And if you look at that $70,000, like that could arguably account for some differences. And geographically, they do make sense. I'll use the example in Coverdale for Bunker Hill. So the average is about you want to be 13 kilometers from a fire station. It's for insurance purposes, basically, it comes to that, but also response time. The 13-kilometer mark from this building, where the fire department is just in between the two roads in Bunker Hill. And so that's 13 kilometers from Salisbury and 9 kilometers from Riverview. And so that's one area that's covered by Riverview. And so that type of spot makes sense. There's some areas like Lower Mountain Road, that's been raised before in the past that is covered by Moncton, but we're closer. And so that's included in that agreement. So those are conversations that we'll have this year to try to get that number hopefully down and reasonable. But for a comparison, it's about 110,000 for Riverview, 80,000 for Moncton, and 33,000 for Three Rivers, so Petty. And the cost for that comes with the fact that it's salaried departments. So that increases it as well. So geographically, it makes sense. There are reasons for those costs being higher, and there are some avenues that we'll explore and bring forward to council. Basically, is this something that we want to consider?
The challenge we had was obviously we received this, although we received it far sooner than other municipalities, only because we, quite frankly, pressured to get it. We got it earlier, but it still comes with all those questions that this year will truly be a year where we're gonna have to dig in, negotiate in some cases, and create a pathway for next year where we'll be able to, set our own destination, but there's a lot of questions, a lot of negotiation, a lot of things we're gonna have to dig into.
So is it fair to assume because our boundaries of our new municipality are greater than 13 kilometers that we're not receiving funds from anywhere else?
We're receiving about 4,000 worth of funds.
From
From Three Rivers.
Okay,
Yeah,
because
from
I
Three
do know
Rivers.
that we share
Yeah.
a lot of calls
Yeah,
with them,
We
right?
do,
Okay,
yeah.
good.
And that will continue, like the idea of mutual aid will still continue, and there's tools in the toolbox that we can use to get more bang for our buck, I'll say, like there's from water access, for instance, if we're using Bunker Hill, just for the sake of that's the 13 kilometers, there's a hydrant closer in Riverview, so can we explore access to water as opposed to driving 13 kilometers back? It's a bad example because there's a river nearby that we could
It's a
get
good-
water at,
It's
but
a good point too, because that is also why we need shared services.
Exactly.
We don't have municipal
Exactly.
water.
exactly.
we
So
need
there's some tools
help.
there that will,
Yeah.
to Mayor Campbell's point, we're still figuring out what those numbers mean and that we'll explore. I will mention one last thing on the RCMP. As council knows, there's a new officer in charge, new OIC.
Mhm.
He'll be coming to the February committee of the whole meeting, and we'll plan to come quarterly, hopefully. And I will say that the conversations that we've had with him of late, he's been very, very quick. So if there's concerns on that front, I would encourage you to bring them up to him. We've mentioned for the latest example around the closure at Parkin and Larson, by the time we had made the request to say, can you please kind of increase your presence and your patrols in the area, he had already sent it to the detachment. So there is an opportunity there, I would say, to build that relationship. So, but he'll be here in February. We go to the next slide, which is specific to the former village, which you will see on the bottom. So 0 shared, 0 outside. The transportation line is about 952,000. Some increases or additions this year is an increase to the staff, so an additional laborer. This is where we saw the majority of inflation impacts. So things like culverts, things like asphalt, all of those things. Every time Diane got an invoice on our desk, I think she wanted to close her eyes before she looked at it because a lot of times they were much higher than we were used to. And then the remainder of those budget costs are comparable or equal to the previous years, based on the similar things that need to be offered. Things like signage, road patching, equipment, snow clearing, those sorts of things that are either contractual or standard, are similar on in those service areas. Next. Environmental health services. So this is, the majority of this is waste collection contracts, hence why there's a lot of subunit specific costs. One additional line is a sum of money, which is not a huge amount, but to act on the climate adaptation report that was done in 2021. So that's a former village specific subunit cost because it's specific to the former village subunit. However, there are some opportunities to look at municipal wide things that apply to the overall entire entity. And then again, existing waste collection contracts are the highest of those. Next slide is pretty straightforward. It's the agreement with Horizon Health for the space for the nurse practitioner. So it's 5,000 even, specific to the former village. And while we're chatting about that, there are increased conversations going on with Horizon about the need for space and opportunity for space and potential for collaborations there. So there will probably be at some point some sort of shared expense there. But the nurse practitioner this past year did increase to 80% of a full-time position. So we essentially pay the rent for them to have that position in place, and the salary is covered by Horizon Health.
That would be, that might be a particular expense that, you know, the former LSDs would be happy to share in, because there certainly is a need.
Right, right.
And
And a lot of the
nurse practitioners, and
Yeah.
I'm sure that there'd be people in the old LSDs that would be delighted to be able to come to
Right.
the village and take a.
Oh, they are
advantage of
today.
that.
They already are.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So-
a lot of the clientele is from
I
outside,
would
but
say,
it's
I
an
would say the
existing
majority
agreement.
is coming, and that's fine.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, it's a great benefit
Yeah,
to
sure.
individuals and healthcare. And
Timely access.
Exactly.
Well, and those are things that people are gonna be more than happy, to be honest with you,
Yeah.
to pay for, to know that's available to them.
That's right. That's right.
And
That's
we,
right.
again, we'll talk about that more in the future. We're having good ongoing dialogue with Verizon on future opportunities and what we can bring service-wise to the community.
Has there been any discussions or rumblings from Horizon about the health center in Petitgoyac being expanded?
That's
or-
a go. That's
That's-
been-
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was determined.
Yeah.
So,
If we
Yeah.
If we go next slide, so environmental development services, is things like planning in essence. So if you look, on the bottom, the majority is a shared expense, the majority, being planning expenses, so about 254,000. That's payable to the Service Commission, who is retained for planning purposes. And then there's some costs specific to the former village subunit. There are some things that are added in there. So some highlights from this service area is an economic development strategy. So where the Service Commission will be assuming increased role for economic development, we want to make sure that we have clear priorities, that we can say, this is what we want to be focused on. This is the potential for us municipally, in Salisbury specifically, to make sure that we're beating that drum very early on. Some engineering professional services, so whether that's reviewing plans to have stamped by an engineer, or whether that's like subdivision plans or actual formal plans, building plans, so on and so forth. That was a shortfall that was often included in projects, specific project by project, but never had a specific budget line. That is specific to the former village subunit, recognizing that the most of engineering requirements are specific to the former village, at least at this time. The continuation of a municipal water source feasibility study. So we've recently received a draft report from Englobe, who was retained by the former village, on exploring the feasibility of a potential water source. Staff has a meeting tomorrow with Englobe to discuss the report, high level, some questions that we have, and we're planning on coming to council with Englobe at the end of this month in January, so you'll see. But we wanted to make sure there was at least a little bit of money to continue, if that is the will of council. A slight increase, sorry.
Was there any assessment done on actual water sources close to?
Yes, yeah, so it looked at two avenues. One, connecting to the city of Moncton water supply in Allison. The second, furthering, there's been a number of studies that have been done within the past 20 years, I guess,
17.
ballpark. Yeah, there's some that has date even past the most recent one, but to look at areas that could be tapped. So it outlines 4 options. They have a recommended one if council chooses to continue exploring it, based on if it's a decision ultimately around cost one, obviously, but looking at, is this something that we want to maintain and own and operate and by ourselves, or tap into someone else and have a risk of increasing costs, so on and so forth, but there is an option.
I've heard that somewhere halfway between here and the big stop, there is good water to be had.
There's some close to that area, yes,
That's
that
what-
is on one of the
That's
4
what
options.
I've heard.
Yes, yeah, and they looked at, basically they took, it's a hydrogeologist
Yeah.
that came up with 4 options, but I don't wanna speak on their behalf because it's a lot of technical language, it's outside of my area of expertise, but they will be here at the end of January and they'll run through that, go over costing, that sort of thing, and it is a detailed report, so we'll make sure that council has that before, the Thursday before, just that there's some time to run through it, but they will be here. There's a slight increase to beautification, which is a specific cost of the former village subunit, and then an increased budget for things like events. So this lives under in the budget, environmental development services, but it's for the most part executed by recreation and wellness. It's one of those things that we would have put in recreation and wellness, but we did not have control over the budget. So it's under a budget line along the lines of, it's for events, but it doesn't say that, but that's why it's there. If we go to the next one.
Celebrate the environment.
You've only said
Yeah.
that, you've only said that 3 times?
I know, because I want to make sure council knows that it's for events and not for
Yeah.
cinemas or whatever it is that's in there. It's something that doesn't quite mean events. Conference centers or something, yeah. It's for events. So recreation and culture, the overall budget, 358,000, the majority of which, is shared expense, with the exception of funds for 33 McDonald Road, which is a property that is also coming to council for further discussion, in an upcoming committee of the whole meeting first. A couple of, high level additions or changes is the fact that the municipality will again operate the Salisbury Lions pool, an agreement again coming to council in the coming weeks, based on some amendments from last year, and then discussions moving forward on a long-term solution, as well as looking, similar to the economic development strategy, looking at a recreation master plan to make sure that we have our capital, but also programming needs clearly identified, that we can incorporate this type of programming in the outside areas, and are prepared to do so and have priorities outlined. So that's the high level of this budget line. Fiscal services is a lot of times either capital investments or outstanding debt payable to the borrowing board, so on and so forth. So this is, for the most part, specific to the former Village of Salisbury subunit. So that's the existing debt. And the total budget line is 257,000. There is some additions this year. We're looking at, there's a line in there for a vehicle, for a truck. That may change based on a recent breakdown of a piece of equipment. So those conversations are ongoing. We'll come back to council if there's any change. We've requested a line item in there. It's smaller than we would like, but at least it sets the precedent around starting to contribute to capital reserves. And then again, interest and principal installments, which again, specific to the former village subunit.
So the truck was in the right unit?
The,
Under fire?
it's under, it says fire truck, but it is
Okay.
under fiscal
So I just
services.
wanted to call that out. That
Yeah.
the
Very
pro-
inexpensive
Yeah,
fire.
fire.
I just wanted to call out that the like, despite our arguing, I don't know how many times.
Many
that,
times.
You couldn't buy a
many
fire
times.
truck for that amount. That just gets into the frustration. I just wanted to call out that of some of the stuff that we've received, and even when we've tried that input into the budget, we were totally shut down. Even in areas we pointed out that can't be right.
Yeah.
We were totally shut down. And just on that note, we will be, once this is all cleared up, we will be making sure that the province understands our, very, I guess the time and effort it took for our staff, all the additional workload that is caused because of what this process has been, as opposed to doing it right the first time.
So any questions on the operating? The utility is only like 2 slides, so we're almost done, I promise.
And then I would like to make a motion.
For a recess, yeah. So we'll run through this quickly. If we go to the next slide, this is
That's
pretty
like
much
a
it.
count for Thorn.
The utility budget applies exclusively to the former village subunit. It covers the wastewater, the municipal wastewater system. So the budget, 465,000 for 2023. There's 1,233 units. And a big expense is the transfer to the general operating fund of 230,000 that I was mentioning earlier, that shows as the biggest non-tax revenue item. We are anticipating significant efforts to be undertaken very soon. Our interest starts accruing in March, and not long thereafter, we'll proceed with some more aggressive collection efforts that we've been working on in the last few months. And this year, the number is between 30 and 40 that we'll start sending to the judgment process or liens against property. So you'll hear about that. The rate for 2023 will remain at $325 per unit. And the bills are expected to be mailed this week or next. So the office is plugging away at those. But that's the high level. It's fairly straightforward for us. We don't have a water system right now, so it's the municipal wastewater system. It's essentially the fees that we recoup cover the transfers as well as the interest, so on and so forth.
So I just have not a question, more of for the area of the Spring Garden.
Yeah.
Sewer that, I just wanted to call out that there is a, if you want to articulate it, but.
There is a wastewater treatment facility that's not ours right now in the entity in Spring Gardens and Boundary Creek. They were going to offload that on us this summer. That was the full steam ahead intent. It took one visit by our works manager, Trevor, from outside of the fence to say this is not going to fly. There are trees growing in the middle of the lining and
Right.
half of the aerators are broken. So those are expensive fixes. So they were able to say that we're not getting that at least this year. The municipality's been approached before to take this on. So we fully expect this to come up. And just before the holidays, we got our first call from a resident that was, that had an issue, and had a bit of a runaround, we'll say, to get an answer as to who, they need to go to, which usually we can resolve and help the resident fix. But ultimately, we somewhat have it now at this point, an idea of who's responsible, who does the billing, that sort of thing. But this will be a conversation that will come to council, I suspect, probably later this year. We don't really know. We're not jumping at the bit to assume responsibility for it, because nobody really knows what the infrastructure underground looks like if the visible infrastructure does not meet the standards that we have to meet. So,
There's a baseball field, right?
yes, there's a fence of an old baseball
Yeah.
field. It's a big field. That's another conversation that we asked about land for public purpose. So right now it's listed the equivalent of land for public purpose by the province. They said they have no intent of transferring that to us, but it doesn't serve them any good. So that's another conversation.
Have a midget field.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's gonna be a lot of conversations, but particularly there's other reform that's coming up, whether it's fire services or, again, roads, transportation is being talked about. There's gonna be a lot of conversations. We're gonna have an interesting few years for sure to tackle all of that.
Just that, asset, that sewer lagoon, is it something that we have the ability to decline to take until they bring it up to a standard, or?
I hope, I hope that will continue. It
It's gonna
has
be
in
the
the past.
negotiation, it's gonna be that constant.
Yeah.
It's gonna be the constant, very, very similar. If we hadn't been proactive in this approach,
Yeah.
we would have just ended up taking it on, and there's no way. This whole thing, we've been proactive, and I think we constantly hear we're so much better than other communities. It's because we've been proactive, and we're gonna continue to be, in all regards.
They did tell us at first that there was no treatment
Right.
facility there. So to give a context.
I do remember that conversation.
Yeah, so
Maybe they just give it to us with a pile of cash. and
that's,
fix it.
well, that's the other thing. Like they need to at least quantify what it will look like to cost, like to fix, so on and so
We'll
forth.
have that up and running.
We could probably fix it quicker, I'll put it
That's
that
what
way.
I need,
But so when you
But
say,
with the money,
so when you say they,
the province.
Province.
It's under
The province.
the Department of Environment.
right, okay.
Again, that's what we
Sorry,
get
yeah,
into even later
environment.
when some municipalities are making the decision from the 41.15
Right.
cents from roads. Some municipalities are making that decision to take that on, and they're jumping right into it. There's no way we're gonna jump into anything without doing our due diligence. We, again, right from the whole beginning, well before, a year before this reform took place, we've asked the right questions, we've done a good job, we'll continue to do that.
Yeah, I think it's a wise move because as it relates to roads, there needs to be, like, before we take it over.
Yeah.
They have a lot of work to do.
Right.
That's for darn sure.
And that agreement will be in place until at least 2025. So between now and 2025, I guarantee there will be discussion on that. This is my last slide, other than questions. So our 2023 operating budget and tax rates are final, so they have the minister's or the department's signature. Tax rates then have a trickle down effect of things that they start. So they issue our monthly or our installments throughout the year. They issue the property tax bills to residences in the months to come. What council can move around is buckets within the budget. So there are a few areas that we'll be coming to council with that are in the budget that are probably more than what we need, or things that we covered last year with the existing budget that we have some priorities that we think council would agree with, that we'll come forward with some recommendations, but for the bottom line per se, it's fixed. And then obviously council will be able to determine, like normal, I call it, the 2024 budget moving forward. We're formalizing, my apologies, some internal reporting processes, some chart of accounts to reflect the new entity. And we're also working to identify some areas or some services that we can specify that are specific to subunits. So if it's registrations, for instance, can we quantify how much is in one subunit versus another as we try to get numbers to quantify these things moving forward? We'll obviously continue analysis when other entities publish their budgets. We tried to have that for today and nobody has their budget. So we have limited analysis to be able to be done. We'll continue our updates to council and then by virtue of nature through to the public. And what council can expect is monthly reporting on the overall service areas, where we're at budgeted versus actual year to date. And then quarterly, in committee of the whole can expect formal projections of what was spent this quarter, budgeted, actual year to date, and what we're looking at for the year, or my apologies, the quarter ahead. And then based on the strategic plan, we're hoping from a staff side to bring forward some plan for council to say, this is our recommendation for the next 5 years, with these expenses and with the costs that come with it. Any increase or decrease long-term, because we know there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of questions, and nobody likes to have these things passed on to them right before the holidays at the end of December. So to be super transparent and determine our priorities long-term, and be able to determine financial plan of some sort accordingly. So with that, the next slide just says questions. So that's it. Any questions before there is a motion for a recess? Seeing none.
Do I have a motion for a recess?
Move that we take a short, oh my gosh, second it.
Seconded by Councilor Thorne. Can I have a motion to return to council? So moved by Councilor Blank, seconded by Councilor Oblinas, all in favor? Contrary minded. Let's move on to reports from administration. And we'll start with the adoption of the council CAO policy.
So the first one here, like it says in the agenda, is a readoption. So in essence, council, in the fall approved the former village, council CAO policy. So council chief administrative officer policy. This is a standard, type of document. In form. It differs from one place to another. So some places do formal bylaws, some places do policies, some places include it in the procedural bylaw. It depends on what it is. The intent and the reason that we brought it forward as a policy for the former village is because it's quicker and doesn't require the 3 readings. It is what a lot of places and CAOs will tell you is one of the most important documents from their perspective to have in black and white, to make it really clear what role and responsibility the CAO has versus council, to make that governance and administration branch, for lack of a better word, very clear, and gives that direction so that council knows what decisions or direction is being taken by the administrative side versus what items and topics and decisions will automatically inherently come to council. So a lot of them are very, very similar. When we were drafting the initial one, you'll see in your package that we consulted Riverview, Sackville, St. Andrews, Grand Bay, Westfield, and Florenceville, Bristol. And so it was formally adopted, my apologies, not the fall, July. And the only 2 changes is a change to wording around personnel salaries to clarify the process. So in essence, council will approve a percentage, and then the CAO is responsible for evaluating department head staff are responsible for evaluating their staff. That's formalized in an updated employee manual that's coming to council in February. But then the other piece is the first 2 bullets there are new additions that I took from the Canadian Association of Municipal Administrators Handbook, which is around the evaluation of the CAO. So that's a personal piece, is important to me, but also is important for council to have some sort of accountability mechanism in place for whoever may fill the role, to make sure that there's those checks and balances in place. So without diving into it, the real intent of it is to, in black and white, clarify those things. It's also used, I hope that we never have to get to this place, but in some places it does have to be used to protect, for lack of a better word again, staff. There can be times where council have certain members or councils as a whole that try to direct staff and administration to do certain things, which can put administration in a particular position. If there's priorities from a strategic perspective that are determined, then you have individual councilors saying, I need to do X, Y, Z, and you have no option to. It puts them in an awkward situation where they often feel obliged to say no or say yes, sorry, and then other things, there's consequences to that. So a lot of municipalities recommend it for that reason. Obviously, we hope that we never get there, but it does set that clear precedent there to be safe rather than sorry, let's say. So that's the essence of it. It really is a document that outlines that governance administration relationship. And it was in your package, so I'm not sure if there's questions, but other than those additions, it is the same as the one that was in July. And to make it super formal, in case we run into one of those situations as the new town, we wanted to make sure that it was brought back forth for readoption. So with that, I guess motion and then questions.
Do I have a motion on the?
I move that the town of Salisbury adopt the council and chief administrative officer policy.
So moved by Councilor Thorne, seconded by Councilor Vittori. Any questions to the motion?
I have a question.
Question, Councilor Bland.
I just have a question around the performance evaluation of the CAO.
Mhm.
Would we be following the same processes in the HR manual as a council for that? Or is there, like, do we have to define that a little bit better, what that process?
It would be similar. Council actually has fair game to decide how you want to evaluate. A lot of times, because there's a lot of, I would say, groups that the CAO deals with. So whether it's council, so council may not see the day-to-day of how the CAO interacts with staff. So
Mhm.
I would always recommend to involve staff to make sure that they have an opportunity to say,
Yeah.
this is not working.
So I'll be coming to council in February.
February, yeah.
February to be talking about this.
Yeah.
And then I'll be giving a report to go through and give council recommendation on various items.
I'm on my 6-month mark, that's why.
So would we recommend putting a policy in place, I guess, to Jason's point,
Yeah.
just so that we're not,
We can, yeah,
that
we
way,
can.
I would never, I don't think anybody
That-
at this
that's
table
what-
would do that, but you wouldn't want any irrational or
Yeah.
quick.
Yeah,
decisions.
That's what we'll be doing.
Right.
Yeah. It's ultimately up to council,
much better.
to determine that, so we can have a separate one. The employee manual does speak to it a little bit, but in essence, the beauty of when we have a strategic plan too, will pretty much serve as the evaluation metrics for the CAO, so if the strategic plan isn't being met, something's not being met from a
Right.
personnel for whoever's in this seat. But there is an approach that we could outline in a policy. I would say we just included it in this one, probably, just spell it out more as
Yeah.
opposed to having a separate one, but we can definitely do that, and I would say we start with
It
that
should- we should
conversation
be
in
keeping the
February.
thing, we can have a conversation, but the HR manual's there for a specific reason.
Mhm.
We should be having everything centralized in one
Yeah.
document.
I like
So,
that.
but we can have that conversation.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I do agree though, it
Yeah,
should be written down.
Like, I don't have any questions or concerns about this year or even the next 3.5 years, but for future.
Oh, we have to,
Yeah,
we have to
we
do
need
the
to make sure
foundation
that
for
we're-
the future.
When not in black and white. that's-
Absolutely, absolutely. Councillor Thorne.
My question was around the second item that's being added to this, for salary increases. And it kind of reflects back to the budget, and I should have asked it then,
Yeah.
but did the facilitator put in a wage increase for staff? So
Yes.
are we allowed to know what that percentage is
Yes.
here, or is that included?
I would say in February.
Okay.
In February, I'll be coming in a closed session first, so there's two elements to this. The facilitator did authorize a percentage for cost of living and
Mhm.
merit.
Right.
And so what we did, so earlier prior to that in the fall, in the summer first, council authorized us to work with an HR consultant to
Mhm.
do an overall HR audit as we prepared for the new entity. And part of that was a compensation audit. So in February, in the closed session, I'll have the results of the compensation audit, recommendations to council for corrections related to salaries and wages, the percentage that was approved in the budget, updates to the employee manual, and there's a fifth thing that's related to that, but there are 5
Okay.
things that I would wait, we do there because it is
Yeah.
personnel related.
Yeah.
But it's kind of
Okay.
similar to the relative ranking process, like you have 20%, you can allocate it based
Yeah.
on your.
Yeah, and that's
Right.
based on the
Discussion
evaluation,
with
then
the
it will,
evaluation.
this will connect with that in the performance management related to the rest of the
Right.
employees, because it's a
That's good.
percentage,
It's good.
percentage
I
based.
like that problem, it's good.
Any additional questions to the motion? We have no further questions. All in favor?
I-
Contrary minded? And motion carried. Alright, so, readoption and financial management and procurement, policy.
Very similar to the last one, a readoption. So this is a
I
policy
just
that.
want to call it, the reason we're doing this is we have a lot of new council.
Yes, yeah.
And we thought it was very important that we bring it forward.
Yeah.
We all start on an even slate.
Yeah.
And that everybody is aware of things that have been passed in the past and give you all opportunity to understand and ask questions.
And change things. if
And
needed.
change things if
Yeah.
needed.
So this is the one that was adopted in the fall. My apologies in the last one. So in September, it was approved, and very similar to the council CAO policy, outlines in black and white, essentially financial thresholds, procurement principles, procurement approaches, to make sure that council knows what thresholds exist, when, how, and why. So ultimately, formerly what used to happen is every expense from $5 to $500 to $5,000 to could be 5 million would come to council. That's not necessarily an efficient use of time when there's staff that are executing those. So it outlines in clear black and white what employees versus department heads versus the CAO versus when needs to go to competitive procurement, when quotes are sufficient, who can sign off on what. It outlines that process and those delegations of authority essentially. And so again, package is in there. There were questions when we brought it forward initially in the summer around whether or not there was any conflicting requirements with the Procurement Act. Nothing is in contradiction to the Procurement Act, but it stipulates the threshold. So the thresholds for the Procurement Act are around 120,000. It outlines our requirements underneath that. So basically anything over 10, we consider something that needs to be procured competitively in some way, shape or form. So either getting formal quotes, tenders, RFPs, that sort of thing. And anything over my threshold, which is $29,999.99 of budgeted expenses, has to come to council. So you'll see most of those are done either via tender or formal RFPs, but that's the essence of it. And again, where it's a readoption, it was in the package. I would say we do motion, then look for questions.
So do I have a motion?
I'll move that council adopt the financial management and procurement policy.
So moved by Councillor Roblinus, seconded by Councillor Thorne, and questions to the motion.
One of the best policies we've got in place.
Absolutely makes it efficient. So if there's no questions to the motion, all in favor?
Aye.
Contrary minded? Motion carried. Number 3, approval of the terms of reference for committee of council.
So I'll preface this with a little bit of, I guess, legislative context. So the Local Governance Act, as well as the procedural bylaw, stipulate some requirements or some explanations around committees. So these would be formal committees of council. Moving forward, we'll probably see the need or the want amongst council for more. In the past, the former village, I should say, has had a number of different committees that has worked on a number of different things. So there was one for community days, one for an action committee for Parks and Rec, beautification, for instance. And essentially, we're proposing 2 terms of references today. So that's what makes it become a formal committee of council. There is a reason that we're bringing one of them to the first meeting of council. We're not trying to just say, oh, surprise, we're diving right into this right away. There is one that we are hoping to get started with sooner rather than later, and that's specific to essentially a volunteer awards committee. So annually, there used to be a barbecue that was done for volunteers that wasn't done last year. Our intent was to transition that from something during volunteer week, which happens in the spring. And so we were hoping to, with some input from the last council around that time, do something a little bit more formal to recognize, put out call for nominations of formal, essentially volunteer awards on top of recognizing the people who dedicate a lot of volunteer hours. So we're proposing that this become a formal committee of council, which in essence would have, again, these terms of reference, and essentially it would task that group with working with staff on the inside for calls for nomination, and then evaluating the applications that come in. And there would be council appointments that would come as well as resident appointments. So even the residents that are appointed to this are appointed through council, but those would come after. We need the terms of reference first, then we need to develop the call for nominations, so on and so forth. But should this be approved or amended in some way by council, the intent will be to regroup internally to say, okay, how do we make this happen? What will this look like this year? When will we be coming back to council for appointments, so on and so forth. And the second one is what we're calling the Community Enhancement Committee. I stole that from another municipality. I did not make it up. But in essence, it serves as an advisory role for what used to be those other committees, as well as events, more broadly, and eventually grants. So you'll see in the next couple of months, there's a draft grant policy coming forward to council, and this committee will basically be an additional branch on the front end for any larger or multi-year grants. They'll evaluate in addition to staff to then come forward to council with a recommendation on these things. So those are the 2 terms of reference that are in front of us today. We are, like I mentioned, ready to have those discussions internally to see what we do for that one in April. The other one will come later on, but we'll use the call for nominations for both. So that's why we're bringing both forward to give people an option if they're not interested in the volunteer one, but maybe would be well fitted for the other. That's the intent. So with that motion and then questions on the terms of reference, my apologies for the approach in general.
New councilors like that? You want to read it?
Sure, why not?
Move that and then read that. Move that.
So I move that it is recommended that the council adopts the terms of reference for the Salisbury Volunteer Awards Committee and the Community Engagement Enhancement Committee and direct administration to begin recruiting for the Volunteer Awards Committee.
Moved by Councillor Lee Dykstra, seconded by Councillor Bannister. Questions to the motion?
I need to say that I love this.
I just think it's great also.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So,
Seriously,
much
since we
needed.
took it, we took this from other municipalities as
Yeah.
well. This is something that,
Super happy.
I think this is one of the first conversations Austin and I had around, again, timing with COVID and everything else going on. This is something
Yeah.
that you know as a council, we wanted to do a year and a half.
And I
ago.
think like our community is known for the volunteers and the events and the volunteers putting on the events. This is fantastic. No questions.
We have no idea what this will look like yet, so if you have suggestions, please let us know. Otherwise, we'll chat
I will
amongst department
always
heads
have-
tomorrow
I'll
and figure out
always
where
have
we go.
opinions.
I think like anything, in the very, and I'll give compliments to the council, that's come forward from previous councils, progress over perfection.
Yeah.
We need to be a community that does.
Yeah.
And that we move forward with things, and we will make it better over time, and, like everything we've been doing, it's been good for the community. And, this will be just another. So with that, with no questions to the motion, all in favor?
Aye.
Contrary minded? Motion carried. Appointment of officers.
This is a lot of formalities, so there is a total of 5 that are within this CRF that all need to be moved separately. So I'll start with that. These are appointments of officers for the new municipality. So there's some legislative requirements that need to be in place. For instance, the municipalities need to appoint an auditor. Municipalities need to appoint a clerk. Municipalities need to appoint a treasurer, so on and so forth. The minister appointed me as the CAO, so essentially that's done, but as a formality again, it would just be good to have it reconfirmed as the new entity on record, because otherwise there's nothing in the new town to say that Austin is the CAO. And there's nothing in place for the clerk, treasurer, or auditor. And by the same virtue, from a, I guess, risk management or continuity perspective, without a clerk, you can't have a council meeting. Without a council meeting, you can't have decisions. And so it's recommended to have an assistant clerk appointed. So that will be Scott. So in the absence of Diane, that could be vacation, or it could be actual absence if something were to happen, that we can have that continuity for any reason. So you'll see that the motions are worded and reference the sections of the Local Governance Act for those appointments of officers within personnel. The other one is the appointment of the auditor, who is proposing continuing the same auditor that we used for the past former Village of Salisbury. It's mentioned in here, but I will preface that piece with a lot of municipalities are having a very, very challenging time securing their auditor for this year. A municipality that's merging 3, so that had an option hypothetically of 3 auditors, has one in St. John. And it's that way. So opposite direction of St. John. A lot of the new entities came to us saying, who do you use for your auditor? Because none of them are even returning our emails. So they're all busy. So we're very lucky. We have confirmation that our auditor is willing and able to continue. So that's our recommendation for 2023 on that front. So we don't do it internally. It's an external auditor, but it's the same one that the former Village of Salisbury used. So that's the context on the 5 motions that are on the floor. But again, they all have to be moved independently. So we can move one by one and then ask debate questions after each subsequent motion, basically.
Do you want me to start? I can start.
Please.
I move whereas section 71(1) of the Local Governance Act requires that Salisbury as a local government have a clerk appointed to carry out duties outlined in section 74(1) of the Act, as well as appoint a treasurer to carry out duties as outlined in section 76(1) of the Act. The Council of Salisbury hereby appoint Diane Ailes as clerk/treasurer for the town of Salisbury effective January 1st, 2023.
All right.
You could just share with me. I'm sitting.
You got it? Okay, go ahead.
Councilor Colwell, seconded by
Oh.
Councilor Olinas. Any questions to the motion? No questions, all in favor?
Aye.
Contrary minded, motion carried.
Congratulations.
Take a breath.
Wait, you're hoping they said no.
Keep sending the checks.
Yeah, well, really, actually, if we didn't say yes, we couldn't continue with this meeting.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
I just wanted to call that out,
Yeah.
but,
I can do the next one. I move that pursuant to section 74(2) of the Local Governance Act, the assistant clerk shall have all the duties of the clerk in their absence. That Salisbury Council hereby appoints Scott Landry as assistant clerk for Salisbury effective January 1, 2023.
Seconded.
so moved by Councillor Laney, seconded by Councillor Thorne. Any questions to the motion? No questions to the motion. All in favor? Contrary minded, motion carried.
I'll motion the next one. Whereas section 71.1 of the Local Governance Act requires the appointment of an auditor, the Council of Salisbury hereby appoint Ernest & Young as the auditor for Salisbury for 2023, effective January 1st, 2023.
So moved by Councillor Bannister, seconded by Councillor Weed Extra. Questions to the motion?
I have a question. Did the former village ever go to like RFP for auditors
Not for 2023.
ever though?
I don't know whatever.
And for me, for an extended term?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
what, so in the procurement policy too, that's one of the, what's considered a professional service for something that's
Right.
recommended for multi-year, so we'll probably look at that in 2023.
Yeah, and then you're like
You're
guaranteed
guaranteed.
to have
So
them
guaranteed.
at a fixed price
Yeah,
or,
exactly.
you know,
Yeah.
set out price. Okay.
My question, I guess, is around, obviously, we've used this service previously, we know them. But now, do we have an idea? Because, again, bringing in the LSD areas, do we have anything from a budgetary perspective, any perception of what this is gonna cost us?
We budgeted an increase, I forget
I
what.
know we budgeted, but
the-
if they come back.
That's what the facilitator, what they're budgeting province-wide. There will be limited, I can't say it, there won't be any increases, there will be some,
No,
obviously, there's
yeah.
more to audit. There will be limited because we're not merging existing entities that have.
Yeah, so
existing
that's my
accounts.
question. So the existing accounts that are
Yeah.
at the province, I'm assuming would fall under their auditing, but we're handing money over to them for those services. So is it still, are we still gonna be charged for?
What do you mean, sorry?
Well, we still have, regardless of, like the services, I guess, well, the 41.15 cents is gonna pay for roads.
Yeah, that doesn't
No,
even come
that's
to
not,
us.
that's a
Doesn't
state,
even come to
that stays separate, but for everything else, for all the transactions, everything that takes place in those entities, we're gonna be responsible to be audited for.
There, yeah.
Um,
There will be limited comparatively, so if we were merging with existing entities, there's existing contracts that are in place, each of which have to be audited. For us, the only new contracts are essentially waste collection.
Yeah.
Everything else will be similar, or the same.
Well, there
So
shouldn't be a
it-
significant,
other
other
than-
than significant bump in,
Other than we'll probably look at things like tax rates, those sorts of things to
It'll
take
take a little
into
more time.
account. Yeah,
a little more, yeah,
Right.
I get that, which will be.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I'm just hoping that,
Comparatively.
I'm just hoping our facilitator
yes.
accordingly, and that's kind of one of the gray areas we don't know in any of these
Yeah.
areas.
Yeah.
So getting back into the discretionary spend that Austin had mentioned earlier, we don't have a lot of discretionary spend later to be able to wiggle and find room to pay for certain things. So if we start to take little hits here and there on 10 grand, it does matter a lot.
That is something that we discussed internally even to figure out what we do.
We're lucky we have somebody.
That's the
Yeah.
problem for 2023.
And I,
Yeah, you were lucky,
Councilor
yeah.
Thorne around, I do think we
Yeah.
need to have a longer term vision to get some locked-in services to
Mhm.
perform. So with that, with no any additional questions for the motion? With no additional questions, all in favor? Contrary minded, motion carried. With that, we now have item number 5, election of the deputy.
We're not there
mayor.
yet.
We're not there
You're, yeah.
Oh, two more, one more.
We can do the next
You're
one.
skipping, you're skipping. I get it. I get it.
What's the next one?
Yeah, that's next.
Okay, I'll do the next one. I move that as noted in a letter dated December 8th, 2022 from the Minister of Local Government and Local Governance Reform, the Council of Salisbury confirmed the appointment of Austin Henderson as the Chief Administrative Officer for Salisbury effective January 1st, 2023. So moved.
I don't know, I missed that one. So moved by Councillor Thorne, seconded by Councillor Joe DeTore, and any questions to the motion?
So many.
Very good.
No
Also,
questions
best
for
decision we
motion?
ever made.
I don't know what you guys.
Yeah,
I tried to make him sweat a little bit. but,
I said
Let's
the
skip
financial thing
hint,
was.
hint,
that
Yeah.
actually-
There is still one more too before you skip to the next
Yeah.
one.
One more, yeah.
I should mention on this one too, before we go, to mention, the reason that we're adding this one, we won't do it immediately, but while we're doing the formality motions, we wanted to have it done to sign, a signing authority is the same reason that we have a redundancy in the assistant clerk. Because it needs to be signed, all checks need to be signed by Diane. I have no interest in signing any checks unless I absolutely need to, but if something were to happen, we need to have
So
that.
we haven't.
Just to give people a
Yeah, that's
perception
true.
on that, when we transitioned from the old, when I came in as mayor, during that period, there was a gap in time transitioning to the new bank. That
It was transitioning to a new signing
new
authority.
signing authority that took time. And in that case, if the client's on vacation, things are going on, people need their vacations and then their time off. It's, from a business continuity perspective, it's very important for work to do that.
I forgot to go to the vote for the last.
Yeah.
one. Sorry.
Yeah, we
Jumping
still have
the gun.
another motion on the
Okay.
floor.
For Austin.
I'll do the next one, right?
No, we
No,
have.
we
have-
All in favor?
I jumped the
Oh.
gun.
I thought we voted.
No, you seconded it. Okay,
Oh,
sorry, that's my
okay.
fault.
All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Reminded? No. Nice try, Joe. Making sure.
One more to go.
All right then. I move that council authorize the clerk treasurer to add Austin Henderson, chief administration officer, as an additional signing authority for the municipality of Salisbury on all municipal bank accounts.
Seconded.
Moved by Councilor Tory, seconded by Councilor Thorne. Questions to the motion? No questions, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Contrary minded? Motion carried.
So quick question before we go to the next thing. We didn't have to redo the fire chief.
We don't.
He's
Yeah,
not an
he's-
officer.
no, right. Yeah. Not an appointed officer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Item number 5, election of the deputy mayor.
So for this one, I'm going to pass it over to Diane, who's going to read through the process. This is our first year with the procedural bylaw, with our new one, our first meeting and first year. So I'll read it, pass it over to her to read us through, the process and what we can expect, and then we'll pass it over to council.
So process as follows for the election of deputy mayor. So mayor will call for nominations for the position of deputy mayor. Councilors can then nominate a councilor for deputy mayor, or self-nominations are also permitted. The mayor will check with each nominee as to whether he or she will want to serve as a deputy mayor if elected. At the conclusion of the call, the mayor will call again 3 more times for nominations. Once all nominations are received and accepted by the nominees, the mayor declares the nomination closed. Should there be more than one nomination to enable council to make an informed decision on how to vote, once the nominations are closed, each nominee will have an opportunity, but not required, to say a few words not to exceed 2 minutes in support of their candidacy. After all nominees have spoken, the mayor will call for a vote. The clerk will then call on each member of council to state the name of the candidate they choose to vote. And that vote will be tabulated and the results will be read into the record. If there's a majority of council present votes for for one candidate, then of course that candidate gets named deputy mayor. If there's no majority, the mayor will ask if any nominees are willing to withdraw their candidacy. No one will be dropped from the ballot in this case unless he or she wishes to withdraw their name. The reason for not dropping anyone is that the councilors are entitled to change their minds and vote for someone else in a second ballot. And if this happens, those with the lowest votes can potentially attract enough votes, new votes, to win. Afterwards, the list of candidates, not including those who withdrew their names, will be read and a second vote will then be called. This process will continue until such time as a candidate receives the majority of the votes cast. Then a proper motion will be taken.
Okay. Nominations are now in order for the office of deputy mayor. Are there any nominations for deputy mayor? Councilor Tory?
Yeah, I just want to take a couple of minutes. I appreciate the fact that most of you replied to an email that I sent just a few days ago, giving you my intention to nominate Councillor Phyllis Bannister for the deputy mayor position, and I'd like to be able to articulate once again for everyone, and to make it basically a public nomination so that everyone was aware. First of all, let me say, as I did in my email, that I think that we have an incredibly talented council here, and I look forward to seeing over the next 3.5 years a number of different people in this particular role. I think, though, with the first year, that this year is not only historic, it's also symbolic. We are bringing together people from inside and outside the village, and I think it's very important, considering not some of you, I know that I have received some very, very positive responses, but some not so positive from some of our residents. But firstly, let me start by saying that my intention to nominate Phyllis is not just for the other reasons that I will mention. In terms of her suitability for the role, I have some personal observations to share in support of her consideration, as well as some practical and public reasons. Allow me to start by what I believe are the most important reasons. Firstly, I've had the opportunity, the pleasure to work with Phyllis during the transition process, and I'm very impressed with her leadership, her dedication, her personal attributes that would serve the council and, more importantly, the residents of the town of Salisbury very well. I believe her business acumen would be a valuable asset in this first year and beyond. Phyllis is also very well known and very well connected in the broader community, both inside and outside of the village. While the above speaks volumes to warranting our trust in her for the role of deputy mayor, there are also other considerations that I think we should be mindful of from an optics perspective that add to, but are not, and I reiterate, are not the primary reason for my nomination. In fact, I would with great confidence be satisfied to support my case solely on the attributes mentioned above. I cannot, however, not mention the following, which I hope is going to be taken in the right spirit. Firstly, as we have only just recently received the budget, as has been mentioned many times, and all the related data for our review, we cannot ignore the fact that roughly and coincidentally, 69% of the tax base, 69% of the residents, 70% of the voters are outside of the village. And yet we have roughly 62% of the council is from the village. So I trust that everyone will do everything well. It's not about trust. I think it's about us making a statement. I think it's really important that our residents that are outside the village see that we're working collaboratively together. And I can't think of anything better than to have a mayor from the village and a deputy mayor from outside the village come together. I think it's going to be very important for us moving forward. And you know, as far as I'm concerned, I think that optics are important. I think also in the spirit of diversity and inclusion, I would be remiss if we did not consider the value of having more equitable representation in the two most important roles that we have in the council. So without any further ado, I'd like you all to give some consideration to how important this first one is, how it brings both the village and the people from outside the village together. And again, these are one-year appointments. And I personally, as having been a leader of many people for quite a number of years in my previous role, I see this as a personal development opportunity, and I'd like to see it spread around the council over the course of time. And so I would like for everyone to consider Phyllis as a candidate for this role.
No, thank you, Councillor Tory. Councillor Bannister, do you accept the nomination?
I do accept and thank you very much for the nomination.
Are there any further nominations? Are there any nominations? Are there any nominations? Being no additional nominations, do I have a motion from the floor to?
I'd like to motion that we appoint Councillor Phyllis Bannister to the deputy.
We say elect.
Elect.
There we
That
go.
we
Sorry-
elect.
Sorry to be picky.
You know, this is all.
That's why you're here.
It's all new. It's all
That's
new
right.
for all.
So we elect Councillor Phyllis Bannister as deputy mayor for the coming year.
Moved by Councillor Tory, seconded by Councillor Thorne. Any questions? Motion? Any questions to the motion? All in favor?
Aye.
Contrary minded? We have our deputy mayor.
Yay.
Thank you, everyone, so much. I hope I do not let you down. My intention is to work as hard as I can for all of you and all of our residents in the greater town of Salisbury. Thank you, everyone.
Congratulations.
Congratulations.
Really historic evening tonight. With that, we have advocacy letters. And, to believe me, we want to restore these on public records, so the public understands how we're looking on their behalf.
I'll give a bit of context. So there are two letters included in the package, one of which is addressed to the Premier, the second of which is addressed to the Minister of DTI, as well as the MLAs for the area, both of which will get a copy of both, but specific to the P380 bridge. So for those that are unfamiliar with that term, it's the bridge that's just outside the elementary school, that is formerly just outside of the former village boundaries, that is now part of the current town. It's been a topic of concern and of mention and of advocacy for the former council for quite some time, but now it's officially within our boundaries. As part of that, we're encouraging sending of this letter or something comparable. There will have to be some tweaks in light of some developments in the last week, but that's because it also addressed some other infrastructure deficits within the community. One of which now sees a full road closure because the culvert requires full replacement. So that would be the culvert on the 106 between Parkin Street and Larson Street. So the initial letter, when it was drafted and ready for the package, does not include that update. So we'll obviously tweak some language to that effect. And then on that same topic and this topic broadly, I spoke to Minister Holland, so the MLA for Albert, and the Minister of Natural Resources, his EA this evening, right before the council meeting. He called because we had spoken with the minister last week to discuss a number of matters on that closure. They've committed to getting a meeting arranged with the minister, and he did say they are hoping, obviously they need to confirm details. The district engineer was on vacation, but they're hoping, and he's back this week, so they're hoping to get something arranged for next week, and they're hoping for the minister to come here so that we can have a meeting in the morning, and then they can take him out to see these assets. So while it was ironic, I guess, that we have this letter ready for our first meeting and the road was closed before we got to move the motion and sign it, I think it's a testament to the importance of sending this in writing, keeping it on record, and sending the message that it's a priority for the new town. So I'll speak, I guess, to those and give that context, and then if we want a motion and then more discussion, changes, concerns, questions to the effect of either one of the proposed letters.
I move, this is where we're at, yeah. I move that council authorize administration to send the letter requesting an update and information on the P380 bridge to the Minister of Transportation Infrastructure and continue to update council on any developments that may rise, as well as including, do I have to add that? So we're adding the other things.
No, you can just say that we authorize this in the letter. We will, yeah, you can, yeah, 'cause
Period.
it's period.
Seconded.
So moved by Councillor Thorne, seconded by so moved by Councillor Colwell, seconded by Councillor Thorne. Questions to the motion?
I have a question.
Yes.
Since have the intent on the minister coming, and we've got two that are pretty obvious that need to be addressed, are there any others that while we have their attention, that we should add to this? Because a lot of times you're only gonna get to go to the well one time.
Yeah.
And if we do have some things that really need attending to, let's add them.
Yeah, we plan on, as far as the schools, we've had a broad discussion on all instruction in the area.
Right.
And they've been very receptive and open to, let's be clear, and Austin knows it, they were some pretty frank discussions, so.
That's the way to have it.
And at the end of the day, they're open. I will give credit where credit is due, that they're open to come meet and review and walk through and go through that. So it's a good starting point. For sure.
And maybe while you're at it, you can give them a little poke for some of the roads that are.
Yes, I was just gonna say.
And no, we
LSD.
will, and part of it, in one of the letters, it obviously talks about some strategy as well that have been discussed with the premier, been discussed with various ministers at that level around the importance of our area. And that's been talked about significantly. And so as much as this is frustrating in the long term, there are significant opportunities and advantages our area has to, I can't remember who it was earlier, I think it was you, Joe, that how do we elevate ourselves above? Again, there are bridges collapsing all over the
All over.
province, infrastructure is collapsing as well, but we have come forward with, I believe, a pretty solid, plan on what elevates us. We do have, buy-in from the minister on that. We've got buy-in from other surrounding mayors and other communities as well that they're in support of it. So I do believe it puts us in a good position at least to come to the table and get something done.
Yeah, because our tax base, I mean, just based on some very preliminary calculations that I made, that 0.4115 amounts to about $2 million.
It's a lot of money.
And that's a lot of money for roads, and I'd be hard pressed to have any resident tell me they thought they were getting value for that money in the town of Salisbury.
Absolutely.
We are, I will mention too, from this I would say would be more of the political side of things, that so if there are priorities that you know of, there's definitely three that we want to discuss, two of which are culverts, one of which is the bridge. The other culvert ironically is on this same Route 106, but there are ongoing discussions with them. There have been for a while, but those are three for sure, on top of just the importance of those investments in infrastructure broadly. But then administratively, the district engineer is coming out here on the end of the month or the start of February. It's been moved a couple times, but to meet with Trevor, our works manager, and I to discuss specifically high level municipal reform. So the start of looking at contracts, what that looks like, any changes. So we were incorporated as a village, we're now incorporated as a town, which have some changes as it relates to DTI's standard, basically operating agreements with municipalities. It gives us some more authorization for certain things like signage. So it's for us to get a better understanding of that. Discuss some of those for 0.4115 cents, where those are going. Some of the priorities that DTI has. They do have, and I think we included it in the report, but I can't remember for sure. They do have a map out now that shows for the next 3 years what work will be done, including patching, asphalt replacements, like those main things, I say, with the exception of every individual patch, but the larger kind of stretches of roads that will see certain patching, certain work done. There is some within the new municipal boundaries. I would argue not $2 million worth, but that's a discussion that I'll have to have with the district engineer. But that'll be the first time that I've met him in person, at least, and the first time he's been out here for a while, if at all, since he started during COVID. So that'll be good to have him here, so that he can get a feel for it. Obviously, he's no stranger to the area, but
No.
he covers a very big area, and he's been there for a year and a half, and he's been great for us to
Yeah,
have those
I
conversations
think
with.
I'd
We'll
like to
get
go
him
on
here,
record,
so.
just so we are on record, that he has been very open. He takes calls at all hours of the night, early Saturday mornings at 5 o'clock in the morning. I will give credit again where credit is due. It's probably a thankless job, but he does take the calls. He is responsive. And again, he is obviously a middleman budget-wise in a lot of areas, so I do think it's important that those individuals, I would like to go on record to give him credit for that.
And as we look forward to know exactly what that 4115 goes to, like those will be ongoing discussions with council. So please, if you hear from residents on specific areas, those sorts of things, we've had discussions internally about what do we do with these? Because we used to say you need to go here or there, but now they're within our entity. We don't manage the road. So do we help and also echo those concerns at the same time, tell them to go to DTI? So we're trying to figure out what that looks like, based on how much we get in. From residents, but I would encourage you as elected officials to keep us posted on any specifics, that we can make sure we're bringing these up as we have these discussions internally.
Just to give you an example on allies and then working with those individuals, even around traffic counts and the ability to do studies with the province on the importance of our area. I would say that the district engineer bent over backwards to get us numbers. We were able to put in a proposal on government on the importance of our roads. So I think it's important to develop those relationships. So thank you.
I don't think we voted on that.
All in favor?
Aye.
Contrary minded? Motion carried. Number 9, bylaws.
no bylaws to bring forward. You will see that all of the bylaws that, that require, adoption by the new entity will be brought forward for the most part, at committee of the whole first. So you'll get an introduction to those, but those will be coming, in the months ahead. We're starting with any ones that have any cost is our internal priority to look at, from a revenue perspective. And then it will be up to council to determine from a policy perspective and a long-term strategic perspective, what they want to have, within those, but nothing for this evening.
No opposed.
No items for
No
closed
opposed.
as well.
Mayor, councillor, and statements and inquiries. Maybe you could articulate to the, because this is part of the new procedural bylaw, you could articulate, on this area of the agenda.
Do you want to mention what they used to do, Diane, to give them some context, or do you want me to run through quickly?
Say, tell them what you want them to do.
So it's-
We're wondering what we did in the past.
So in essence, this is the section where if there's items, specific items that councilors would like to bring up, questions that weren't addressed, those things of the like, in the new procedural bylaw, this is the section for it. If there's none that are specifically brought up, there will be nothing under the agenda. We'll skip the item and go to notices of motion and resolution automatically. But feel free to any specific questions, any items that you want on the record, those sorts of things. We'll have discussions moving forward around item 12, so the notices of motion, and resolutions. That's where there's a little bit more, technicalities and formalities involved, as we create the council agenda. So if there's a notice of motion from an elected official, in essence, it goes under section 12 unless it's already included on another agenda item. In essence, to ensure that if it's something that will bind us from a cost perspective, from a staff time perspective, there's opportunity for us to quantify that in a CRF, in a council report form. And we're still getting our heads around. It took us probably 3 hours to run through the procedural bylaw to go through all the scenarios that are there. That is one section that we'll make sure council's aware of as we get into the normalcy of getting new items, priority setting, that sort of thing, so that it's super crystal clear for everyone, both staff and council, on the notices of motion. But the item number 11 is really for questions that you want on the record, inquiries that we didn't discuss, updates on anything. So say, for instance, it's the February council meeting and we haven't updated you on the closure of the Route 106, for instance, that's something you can bring up, that sort of thing. This is the section that you would be welcome to do it.
I just have a statement. Are we just allowed to like pop up and say?
Sure.
"Do we
Councilor
want it?"
statements.
Great. So my statement, I just wanted to thank the Department of Public Works and Infrastructure for their fast action for the road closure in D4 around Larson and Parkin. As I live in there, they got the signage up really fast. They've been working to make sure that it's there, that it's visible. So I just think they did a really great job. So
We'll
thanks.
echo
Dylan.
that, and I'll make sure they know, because they have been, they've been spending a lot of time in there, making sure that we can
Yeah.
do what we can. So, yeah, I'll make sure they're aware of that
General
feedback.
statement as well. I just wanted to say that I'm really proud of the people of our new town for seeing strength in individuality and diversity, because when I look around the table, I think we have a fantastic group of people with many different experiences, many walks of life. I think it's just gonna make us a lot stronger as we make our decisions going forward and represent a larger part of our new community. So kudos to them for the ones that were elected in and the ones that were previously elected. I think it's fantastic and I'm looking forward to the next term.
Here, here. I just wanted to just make a statement and a question. It really is about how, and we've talked about this before offline. I think it's, and we've all acknowledged that it's going to be really important for us to reach out to residents. I, for one, would like to see a significant uptick, if you will, in the involvement of our residents in knowing what's going on in their community, being involved where they want to be involved, and being able to know what's happening in the community. And I know it's going to be a huge challenge for us, especially some of us who are not necessarily in the village. We don't have a venue per se that we can say, let's go meet in a church hall or a, you know, or a recreational center or whatever it happens to be. We need to, without going to solution, I think we need to let the residents know that we are going to get together to talk about this. We need to find ways both face to face as well as using technology to get to them, but also to encourage them to be able to get information from us and to go to those places or sources. Cause you know, as an example, you know, I would love one day for Rob and I and, you know, Jason to, you know, we're gonna go out there in Ward 4 and talk to our residents out there. And I think we need to do it sooner than later. We can't have too much time go, before we start reaching out to them.
Yeah, I mean, you know, Councilor Tory and I've talked about this a lot. I do believe as we're bringing this new community together, although we've worked and played and done things together for hundreds of years. Perception wise, I do think we need to get out, and whether that's, I do think we need to hold some various public consultation meetings, particularly as we get more answers around the budget and different items, because it's important for people. And I do think that over time, whether it's community barbecues and some different things we can do will be important, but for sure, over time, it's getting out of the meeting with folks, because they shouldn't have to come here on a Monday evening. We should be up there meeting with them.
Agreed.
I'll just mention that quickly. It's something that's on our radar too, from an outreach or engagement perspective, as well as an events perspective. So it's definitely on the radar and a priority for us as we figure out how we do this. Even getting the boundaries from Canada Post has proven to be an interesting venture, as we know from a mail out that was done in April. So that is something that's on the docket and on a recurring basis, mostly electronically, but offering some sort of option to opt in, probably physically, but also from a longer term events perspective of making sure that we're hosting some of those things in the different wards. So by all means, any suggestions, please let us know. Because we're probably going to do a little bit of trial and error as we figure some of these things out. And I guess from our end, I would just ask for the patience of elected officials and residents as we try to figure it out. And if they have suggestions, to please let us know as well.
Well, again, the community paper, the board, the notices that are put through that as well has been an excellent way of reaching some of the older residents.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
I just have one more item, but again, if you're meeting with Vincent towards the end of the month, but a lot of residents are asking the question around the culvert. And it's a good question around, they're digging it up. Why are they putting the Bailey Bridge or Bailey Lake Bridge in, as opposed to doing the work immediately? And of course, they're asking that because you're doubling or more than doubling the expenses on this piece of work. And, you know, I don't want to make assumptions on it. That's because they don't have the pipe ready to go right now, but at the end of the day, they are right in that assumption, and I do believe that we owe them that answer. And that would be something that, as we talk to the ministers, that I do believe, as well as the district engineer, we do need to answer the public on if you can dig up the whole road right now.
Why not?
And divert sewer lines.
Yeah.
Why are you not pumping the pipe in? And again, you heard me on the call with the ministers, Austin. We were assured a year ago that the pipe was being ordered at that time, and there were procurement challenges. Well, it just means it wasn't ordered because it should be sitting somewhere to put in that road right now. So at the end of the day, that's just a hard question.
Buy some smaller ones.
I can give an update to what we know now. I mean, I don't know long term, and I can't speak for TTI. It's obviously them doing the work, but the digging that they're doing now and today is to increase flow through the current culverts. There were, I can circulate them after as well, some updates of what they're doing down there, but they essentially have exposed the two existing culverts that are there, and you can see where the washout was. It's not even anywhere near the culvert. It goes over the culverts and around the side. So they've opened that up to increase flow as part of their temporary fix. And our understanding is they'll bring in materials to strengthen essentially the berm, so rocks. That's our understanding right now of what they're doing, but I can definitely get some more confirmation around what that will look like. But our understanding as of now is that that's part of the work that needs to be done regardless for the replacement. So hopefully it won't necessarily be counterintuitive and double, but we can definitely get that information and make sure that that we have the information for council to update the public accordingly.
I do just have one statement under that agenda item. Recognize the hard work that staff has put in to get us through the transition, all of the logistics for January 1st, and even just the presentation on the budget, like take something that was, well, we were basically given lemons and you made palatable lemonade. I don't, yeah, okay, lemon cheesecake, but yeah, good job on that, and we greatly appreciate your assessment and analysis of the budget.
I echo that too. The impact and the work of the team has been huge and has been a lot of change and a lot of unknowns, and there's been things that have been standard, and the province has said you will have this date, this by this date, and this by this date, and I don't think they met one of those deadlines. And so we still have to meet ours. And so there's been a lot of bending over backwards, and I would say a lot of headaches amongst the staff. So I'll echo that too, and for knowing that there's going to be many more changes to come as well. So again, I'll say bear with us, but we'll keep plugging away at these many changes. Look forward to what it will bring as well. So thank you.
Just one more thing, because we have a member of, that's in the gallery that brought something up to me today that, again, we talked about policing services earlier today, and we have to be cognizant of the fact that, you know, the boots on the ground, the people that are doing the job, they do a good job. They're obviously dealt with, you know, staffing issues. Found is a huge area that they need to service. It's National Law Enforcement Day here in Canada, and it's very important that we do recognize all of the individuals that, you know, we have one of the busiest traffic areas in the province. The accidents that are fired and they respond to are significant. The calls that they respond to are significant. So although I recognize the fact we don't believe we're getting the level of service that we feel we should get, they are doing the best job that they can to the capability they have, no different than everybody else that's facing staff shortages and budgets. So I just on behalf of council want to acknowledge that day is there for an important reason, and I want to thank the member of our audience that brought that forward to me today. That's all I have. So with that,
No more
with
notices,
that,
no
there's
notices.
no more items. Do I have a motion to adjourn? Or I guess what's the notices and motion?
Notices of motions and resolutions will be where if any counselor has a notice of motion and resolution that's not put in the agenda, would go under here. So that's the piece that we'll bring forward to explain to make sure everyone is crystal clear, but that will be a new piece of the procedural bylaw that would live here.
And for the members of the public that are watching this on recording, this is a new procedural bylaw. This is a whole new way that we're running the council for the first time, and actually since the existence of the council here. So we're obviously learning it. The procedural bylaw will be something that as a council, we can go through, look at over time, and can be modified to our will. So that's something as well that you can all keep in mind. So with that, do we have a motion to adjourn? So moved by Councillor Bland. Second by Councillor Weed Dykstra. All in favor? Contrary minded. And we have the first one of the books, folks. Congratulations.